Welcome to the tutorial Layers. So to understand how layers work in Animate and Animate Pro, we first have to go back to the back end of a scene. So we're in the scene right now all about timing, and I showed you in one of the previous tutorials that in the elements list you can see that there's a folder that corresponds to every layer that exists in the timeline or every column that exists in the X sheet or every module that exists in the network view if you're using Animate Pro. I also showed you that if you go into one of these folders, there are drawings that correspond to the different drawings in a given layer. So the mountain isn't a great example because there's only one drawing. So let's go back to the fighting cloud. So you can see that there's multiple TVGs. So this explains why when you modify a drawing, it's modified for all of its exposures in the timeline because there's actually one drawing. So if I have drawing 5 exposed for 10 exposures and I draw a line through it, you'll see that line in all of those 10 exposures because you're actually modifying the same drawing. You're modifying this one TVG. This is the same when you create a cycle, and it's the reason why cycles are considered to be efficient and light, because you're really taking, say, these first 3 or 4 drawings and you're cycling them again and again, but they're not being copied. They're being taken from this folder and being linked to those extra exposures where they're being repeated. So it's very light because it's not being copied again and again. As well as when you delete an exposure or a drawing from a frame in Animate or Animate Pro, it doesn't actually get deleted, but it exists in this folder and it can be called up again. The only way then that you can actually break from the cycle is to duplicate a drawing. So what would happen is what happens to most files when you duplicate them or you make a copy. So I would have like fighting cloud -3 copy, and so they would be identical, but because the other one has the word copy beside it, it's its own file. It's a completely separate file, and then when you modify it, it'll then become different than its original. So if we go back into the X sheet view, I showed you at one time, I'm just going to save this to get rid of this little red pencil, that if I double click in here, I'm not renaming an exposure, but I'm actually calling up a drawing that already exists. So I call up drawing 2, which I know exists because I can see it right here underneath, and I hit enter. Now I've effectively held this drawing for 2 exposures, or drawing 2 exists on both frame 5 and 6 for the stars, carrots, and fists layer and or column. So what the layer or column is doing is it's searching in that folder for a drawing of the same name that you just entered in this cell. However, if there was no such thing as a drawing 2 in that folder, then what it would do is it would create a new drawing and you'd effectively have a blank drawing that you've renamed whatever name you put in here. If we say new drawing. So now this is a blank drawing that's been created in that folder. So let's undo that. And here in the X sheet, we see that they say number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but if you noticed in the folder, it's actually the folder's name with a dash and this number. So in the X sheet, you really only see that dash number before the .tvg, but in fact, it is the entire name of the folder as well. So there are many different types of layers that you can add to the timeline view or columns that you can add to the X sheet view, but they're not always represented the same way. So the most common type of layer that you can add is a drawing layer, and it's denoted by this symbol here, the red triangle, the yellow circle, and the blue square. So to create vector artwork or to import a symbol, the drawing layer is the best one to choose. The second type of layer you can have is a bitmap layer, and we don't have an example of that in this scene right now, so maybe I'll import one real quick. So I can go to File, Import, Images. So let me browse for one. Sort of just a boring gradient JPEG, but we're going to use that. So here, if we decide to keep it vectorized, you can then treat it like a drawing layer. So if we scroll down It's right here, gradient. It's only one cell. But you can see that it has the same symbol as a drawing layer which accepts vector graphics. So what that means is that you can draw on this layer, so you can mix vector artwork with it, and you can also put other vector artwork beside it on the same layer in the same row. So I can add another vector graphic like that. However, so let's just delete this first. If I then imported the same bitmap image, but this time chose not to vectorize it, what this does, so it's right here, is the symbol has changed, so we know automatically this is a different type of layer. It's actually a little blue landscape with some mountains and a little sun. I'm not only barred from drawing on top of this layer, like adding vector graphics or vector artwork to this layer, I can also not add vector graphics beside. So I can't even draw on the cell beside it or mix it on this layer. So that's what we mean by mixing vector artwork with bitmap artwork. So if you wanted to mix, what you can do, if you wanted to mix and not vectorize, what you can do is actually encapsulate this in a symbol, because then you can do all the things that you would be able to do on a vector layer or a drawing layer with a non-vectorized bitmap image. And for more information on any of that stuff, you should refer back to the video tutorial series Gathering Content, which I believe is pack number 6. So I'm going to delete this as well. The next type of layer you can have is a camera layer, and you can see that we actually have one already in our scene, and it's denoted by a camera, of course. Cameras are not represented at all in the X sheet. So in the X sheet view, you did see some stuff called camera, but what it was actually here in the main part. What it was is the information from the camera peg and not the camera layer itself. If the camera did not have a peg, you would not have seen any of those function columns in the main part of the X sheet view. And cameras are not included in a scene by default, so you wouldn't see one in the timeline. You would have actually had to add one by going to this plus button and adding camera. You can actually add multiple cameras. So let me add one here, and now you can see this is changed to underscore camera 1, but you can only ever have one camera at a time in the timeline view if your scene is set to scene default display, display, and not display all. So when you open Animate Pro scene, by default, your scene is always set to display. I think in one of the previous tutorials I must have taught you what display all was, and that's probably why that was selected. And in this mode you can see multiple cameras in the timeline. However, this is the display mode we're going to work with, and it's what you would see by default if you open up a new scene. So now you can see our camera has disappeared. Our camera underscore 1, that is, and we just have a regular camera. To see camera underscore 1, you would go back to scene, camera, and you would select it from the drop-down menu here. And so now our camera is changed to camera underscore 1. The reason that you would have multiple cameras set up around your scene is that you might want to render frames 1 to 70 using one angle, and then frame 70 to 170, let's say, from another angle. And that also makes sense then maybe to you why you can only have one camera at a time. Whatever camera's in your timeline, and which also corresponds to one that's selected from the scene menu, is the one that's going to be used to render. So that perspective will be used when you're rendering your scene. So the next type of layer that you can have in your scene is an effects layer. Through Animate, you can get it through this Add Layer button in the timeline. The only ones that you can get in Animate Pro are Quad Map, but most of the effects, or all of the effects rather, are added through the network view and the module library. So let's bring that up. So let's add transparency to our network. And then let's expand the network view, and should make it bigger as well. And let's add this transparency. I guess we'll just add it to the fighting cloud, like that. And then if we go to the timeline and search for a new effects layer, which is right here, transparency, which is attached to the fighting cloud layer, we open the data view, we uncollapse the layer. Let's add a keyframe on the first frame of the transparency layer. Then let's scroll down the timeline and arbitrarily add one to, say, frame 30. And let's change the values here to, say, 100. So we went from 50% transparency to 100% transparency. So now a function exists for this effects layer. Then if we select that effects layer and go into the X sheet, we can see that that effects layer now has a column that exists in the effects section of the X sheet view. And here you can see the individual values per frame, which you of course cannot see in the timeline view. You can only see what the values at the first keyframe and at the last keyframe. And of course these keyframes are indicated by this black square here beside the 100. So the next type of layer you can have is a group layer, and we have several in our timeline. We have the Karate Masters actually group, we just renamed it so you can't tell. We have the bird group. So let's enable the entire bird group. And then if we go to the X sheet, you'll notice that all the birds appear as columns. So bird 1, 2, 3, the original bird, but you do not see its group, and there's no indication that these 4 birds are in any type of a group. So that's one more type of layer that does not appear in the X sheet view. And the group layer is denoted by this little box with a gray arrow in it in the timeline view. And I think I forgot to mention that for the effects layers, they're always denoted by a yellow star with the orange outline, unless you open an Animate scene in Animate Pro, in which case the effects are denoted by a purple star to let you know that that effect came from Animate and not Animate Pro. And 2 effects that I also forgot to mention that are sort of special is the quad map effect, which you were able to see from this Add Layer button. It exists here. It's special in the sense that it can not only be added to a drawing layer, but also to a peg. It works sort of as a transformation effect, and its functions can also be viewed in the function view of the X sheet. And one type of effect that does not exist in the X sheet view is a color card. That's when you just put a flat color behind your entire scene. A lot of times this is done because if there's a transparent background, when you render to QuickTime, it'll turn out black. So if you put a white color card, at least that'll eliminate that intense blackness. So the next type of layer we're going to look at is the peg layer. I know we have a couple of those as well. So if we look at, let's look at the punching bag, for example. So the peg is denoted by this S with the 2 orange dots. That's when we know it's a peg layer. If you select the peg layer and you go to the X sheet view, you can see all of the pegs transformations in the function section of the X sheet view. The last type of layer I'd like to talk about is the sound layer. So we don't have any sound in our scene right now, but I'm going to import some sound to show you what the icon and what the column looks like. So we'll go to File, Import, Sound. So our sound layer appears here at the top. It's always denoted by this blue musical note, and you can see the actual waveform in the timeline. And you can change the volume here where it says 100%. And if you go to the X sheet, the sound column is denoted here in the dark gray. I think in Animate it's actually denoted by being green. So there are 3 other types of columns that you can have in the X sheet view, and those are the 3D path columns, the Bezier curve column, and the ease curve column. And then if you're using Animate Pro, you can also have the 3D rotation column, annotation column, and the expression column. So all of these columns are special in that you can attach several different drawing columns or peg columns to these function curve columns. So let me give you an example to make that a little bit more clear. Say you have 4 different types of spaceships. So you have 4 separate drawings on 4 separate layers, but they're all following the same trajectory. They're in a chase and they're all moving at the same speed, curving in the same way, they have the same path. Well, what you can do to save time on animating each spaceship individually is you can create a function column with the said trajectory that you would like these spaceships to follow, and then attach those 4 drawing columns to that function column. And in that way, you're saving time on having to animate them individually. And to learn more about that, you'll have to refer back to the video about animation paths. So now let's look at the various ways that you can add layers to your scene. So you can add layers through the timeline view in several different ways. The most obvious is by clicking on this plus button to add layers. So you can select the layer type that you would like from here. If you know it's going to be a drawing or a peg layer, sometimes it's faster just to click on one of these 2 buttons here to do it automatically. Another way that you can add layers is by right-clicking anywhere in the layer section of the timeline view and by selecting Insert, and you can add the type of layer here, so sound, quad map, peg, drawing, etc. So let's add a drawing layer, for example. Another way that you can do it specifically in Animate Pro is by using the timeline view menu here. You can go to Insert, Drawing, or you can use the keyboard shortcut Command R, and on Windows that's Control R. The last way that you can add a layer is from the top menu, and you could go to Insert, and then once again you have your choice of whether you want to add a camera, drawing, group, or peg. So if you go to Drawing, once again you've added another drawing layer. I believe all of these drawing layers are at the bottom of your timeline. So you can also add a drawing layer in the form of a column in your X sheet. So if we go to the X sheet, you can select this button here, Add Columns, and an Add Column dialog box will appear where you can rename your column, and then you can select the type. So here, unlike in the timeline view, you have a different set of choices for the type of column that you would like. You don't see things like camera or peg, for example. You have 3D path, 3D rotation, so these are the types of columns that you can select from. And if you press Apply, it'll add that column, and you can continue adding different types of columns. So then I can then add like a sound column, for example, and say Apply. If I say OK, it'll close the window. So in Animate Pro, you can have advanced preferences for that Add Column dialog box that we just saw. So in Mac, you would go to Animate Pro Preferences. In Windows, you'd go to Edit Preferences. You could go to the Advanced tab and check Advanced Element Mode. So if you check that, and hit enter, say OK to validate your change. This time when you try to add a column, you get a different Add Column dialog box with more options. So not only can you now rename and select the same set of column types, you can decide if you'd like to create a new column, and if so, whether you'd like it to be vector, bitmap. You can choose what type of field chart you want. That's something that's more with traditional animation that I explained before. Increments are not by like they are in Flash with pixels, it's by fields. You can also use the existing element, which is the same almost as cloning a layer or cloning a column. So if you use one, then what you can do is you can select which layer and or column you want from this drop-down list, and it shows everything that's already in your scene. And what this does is it'll duplicate that column, so that drawing layer, but it will not duplicate the timing. So you can still have the 2 move differently even if the 2 images are identical. So I'm going to close this. So there are also several ways that you can delete layers. So if we go back to the timeline and we scroll down, you can see that you can select a layer in the timeline view's left side and then click on this minus sign here to delete the layer. It'll ask you if you want to delete both the associated module and columns, the module from the network view and the column in the X sheet view, and also if you want to delete the drawing files from the elements folder. So once again, they're referring back to that folder I showed you in the back end of your scene. And so if you want to keep those around, you'd have to uncheck that so that they're there to be recovered if you want to use them again. So I'm going to say OK here. You can also select multiple, so you don't have to do them one at a time, like that. And you can right-click on them and say delete. And once again, you get the same confirm delete message, and I'm going to say OK. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to reorder layers. You probably already know how to do this from previous tutorials, that you can grab a layer and then drag it in the timeline above another layer, or you can drag it below another layer. If you accidentally put it on top of a layer, it actually creates a hierarchy and parents the layer that was dragged and dropped on top of a layer as the child. But the important thing for you to know is that if you reorder in the timeline, it's also going to reorder in the X sheet. The way that you reorder in the X sheet is that you actually use your middle mouse button. And once again, if you reorder in the X sheet with the columns, you will reorder in the timeline. So if I grab bird underscore 3, I use my middle button and I drag it and put it at the top of the group here. So before bird underscore 1 and bird underscore 2, if we go back to the timeline and we find our bird group and we uncollapse the peg, we'll see that bird 3 is now above all the other birds in that layer. The other thing I wanted to show you is how to show hide layers, and you probably already know how to do that as well. You can use the eyes here to enable or disable all at the same time. Bring some of those back in the dojo. You can also use this button here from the timeline view toolbar. You have to select a layer first, and then this one's already enabled, so you can disable it if it's already enabled. If it's not enabled and you click on this, it will enable that layer. You can also disable and enable using buttons in this view if you add them from the extra buttons for the timeline view toolbar. So you can right click, click customize, and you can select disable all others and enable all. If we apply, so then this button enable all acts much in the same way as the enable disable all button, except you can't disable. So this one I can show everything that's in my timeline view in the camera view. However, if I click it again, it doesn't disable. So here you can disable again. And let's bring a few of those elements back. And then this button's pretty neat. It's the disable all others button. So if you decide there's one layer you'd like to see, you can click on this, and what it does is it disables everything but that layer. There's a small bug with this one. It keeps groups enabled in the timeline, but as you see, you can't see them. So even though these look checkmarked in the timeline, they're still not visible in the camera view. And the reason you can't see anything is just because we're not on a cell that has a drawing element on it. So this button disable all others also exists here, show selection and hide all others in the timeline view. So it acts the same way. So if I decide to choose the fighting cloud this time, and then I clicked on this button, so it disabled everything but the fighting cloud. So in Animate Pro, you can also choose what kinds of layers you want to see, and you can eliminate whole groups of layers. And you can do this from the timeline view menu. So if you go here, you and select View, Show, Show Manager, you can decide that you don't want to show effects layers, or you don't want to show group layers, or you don't want to show sound layers. And you can set this as default so that those layers are never shown, or you can restore the default. So if we say we don't want to see effects layers and we say OK, then you'll notice that the transparency on the fighting cloud has disappeared. There used to be that transparency effect that we added. So if we go back to the manager, we can then add the effects again. And now the transparency has been re-added to the fighting cloud. So it's eliminated so that you can clean up your timeline and work. In case, for example, you have a ton of effects layers, this would greatly clean up your timeline view. However, it doesn't disable that effect from not working, it just eliminates it from the timeline because you only have so much space on your screen to scroll up and down. So you can do the same thing through the X-sheet view in terms of the columns. We already looked at the column list manager here, how you can add and subtract. Actually, let me expand this. How you can enable or disable specific columns by checking them individually, and how they're then added or eliminated from the main section of the X-sheet view, and how you can also eliminate whole categories, drawing columns, function columns, etc. One thing we didn't show you is how to show hidden columns. If you see a big, thick gray line like that, it's because they're actual layers or columns that exist between the dojo and the punching bag. In the timeline view, we know this for a fact, because if we go back to the timeline view, between the dojo and the punching bag, we have the punching bag by itself, like not the punching bag peg, but the actual punching bag. So the way to show that is you would click on this line, and it'll give you a list, the same list that you see here, of the various columns that you can add. And so if I wanted to then add the punching bag, it now appears between the punching bag peg and the dojo, just as it would in the timeline view. In Animate Pro, you can also go to the View menu of the X-sheet and select View, Unhide All Columns, and now all of these columns have been enabled, so now we can see them all in the main section of the X-sheet. You can also go to View, Column Type Manager. And here we have something similar to what we saw in the timeline view, where you can decide if you want to eliminate whole categories of columns. So you can do that here too with these icons in the Show Column List, and you can do it here in the column types. And the advantage of doing it here is that you can set it as a default. So if you never ever want to see the functions columns or the drawing columns, you can do it in this box. And then, well, if I pressed set as default, then every time I open the scene in Animate Pro, you would never see those columns. So let's restore the default and say OK. So now let's go back to the timeline layer and take a look at the layer properties. So there are several ways to look at a layer's properties, and by layer I also mean column or module. So you can either double click on a layer to bring up the layer properties, or you can bring them up through one of the other windows by going to the Windows menu and selecting Layer Properties. And so depending on which layer you select in the timeline view, these layer properties will change. You can also, in the network view, select the analogous module. So it'll be Fighting Cloud here, and click on the yellow box, and that also brings up the layer properties, as you can see here. The only difference with the X-sheet in Animate Pro is that instead of bringing up the layer properties, you actually bring up the column properties, and you can do that by double clicking, and they're not the same thing. In Animate, you will bring up the layer properties by double clicking on the X-sheet column. Because we checkmarked that advanced elements option from the preferences panel, we have a different looking column properties box than you would normally see. You would only have the ability to change the name of the column here. However, with the advanced elements, you also have these options here, which is to change the name, vectorize, decide if you want it bitmap format, and once again change the field chart options. So I'm going to close that. The layer properties in the timeline or the network view are a little bit different. You can do many things. You can also rename in this field here, just as you would double click on a layer name to rename it. You could also do it here. You can enable it or disable it. You can lock it. You can enable the onion skinning for this layer. You can change the track color by clicking on this button here. I'm not sure why mine is not visible. It looks black. You should see a rainbow there. Oh, there we go. So I can decide to make it this pink color and say OK. So now this entire fighting cloud row is a sort of fuchsia color. You can also adjust the positioning and animation parameters, which is all the stuff here. You can adjust many other advanced parameters as well by going to the advanced options. Also drawing layer options in the drawing tab for the panel. But if you want more information about the layer properties, because I'm not going to go into in full detail here, you can always go back to the video setting up the scene. So the way that you can duplicate a layer in the timeline is by right-clicking on it and selecting Duplicate Selected Layers. So as I explained before, when you duplicate a layer, you're creating an identical copy, but that can be modified separately. So if you change Fighting Cloud _1, it's not going to affect Fighting Cloud at all. You can actually duplicate a layer in several different ways besides right-clicking. You can also select the layer, go to the top menu, and select Edit, Duplicate. You can also use the keyboard shortcut Command D on Mac or Control D on Windows. Or from the X Sheet view, you can go to the X Sheet view toolbar, right-click on it, and select Customize. Then from the available tools, you can select Duplicate Layer Columns. Add it to your toolbar and say OK. Then if you select Fighting Cloud, the column for Fighting Cloud, and click on this button, it duplicates the layer one more time. So let's delete some of those layers. Cloning a layer, on the other hand, is a different matter. You can clone using the same methods as before. You can right-click and select Clone Selected Layers. You can edit and go to Clone, or from the X Sheet view, you can right-click once more on the toolbar and select Customize, and this time from the list, select Clone Layer Columns. And after selecting a column, click on the button to clone the column. The difference between a cloned column and a duplicated column is that a cloned column is linked to the original. So if you modify Fighting Cloud, then Fighting Cloud _1, 2, and 4 will all be changed accordingly as well. And that's usually used a lot in traditional animation, where you want to change the timing of specific columns, but you want to keep the drawing layers the same. So I'm going to delete those as well. So the last thing I wanted to show you is how to change the color of a column or layer. So you saw how to do it through the layer properties by clicking on this swatch square here, but you can also do it on the layer directly by clicking on this gray box right here. So if we click on that and then select OK, then our row turns into that color. However, if you want to reset the colors of your layers, you have to go to the timeline view toolbar, right click on it and select Customize, and then select both the change track color button as well as the default track color button, apply, and say OK. So the change track color button does the same thing as clicking on the swatch here. However, the reset button obviously resets your layer back to gray, so you can do that for the pink layer as well. In the X sheet, the way that you would change the color of a column, and actually I wanted to test one thing. So if we change Fighting Cloud to yellow, it actually does turn yellow in the X Sheet view for that column. However, if you want to change the color through the X Sheet view, you have to right click on the header of a column and select Color, Change Column Colors, and then select a color and say OK. And if you want to restore these to their default colors, and you can actually select multiple, then you can select Color, Default Column Colors, and then they're reset. So that's it for the tutorial layers. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, exposure.